All right, ladies and gentlemen, in light of the fact that we might have some weather coming in, also because I've stressed to you a few times about how important this material is, I thought what I would do is kind of pick up where I left off in class yesterday, give you some thoughts as we proceed through the rest of chapter 23. Obviously, you know by now that this has been uploaded to YouTube, and I don't know, some magic has happened, and you can be able to use this at your leisure. If I already have a chapter 23 loaded up there, I will name this something differently. You'll know what I'm talking about. But today's date is January 19, 2016, so make sure you got the right file here. Um, on the exposure index, yesterday in class we said that there are various exposure indice systems. What we mean, as I said in class, what we mean, these are systems that give you some sort of number. It's quantifiable. It says you're inside the parameters of an acceptable image or not. And I will tell you that chests tend to be differently numbered than extremities and other things. So sometimes they'll have an index number that is just for chests, and then everything else. Um, let's not get too bogged down in that. I did tell you guys yesterday I wanted you to find out what your exposure index system is. Hopefully you're doing that today so we can discuss it. For now, let's just focus on the fact that the S number, and that's why it's in red, the S number is inversely proportional. The greater the S number, the lower the exposure, or the smaller the number, the higher the exposure is, as I've illustrated on the slide. Companies like Fuji, Konica, Philips, and there are others, utilize the S number, sometimes called the sensitivity number. The exposure index number, or EI number, is a care stream, which is what Kodak is now called, and other companies also are part of that. Is directly proportional. The greater the EI number, the greater the amount of exposure to the patient. Either way, you do need to know who's using what, where you're at, so that you can decide relative to whether or not you've done a good job on your exposure when you make a hand x-ray or pick a part. Some places, like I said, do have indexes that'll say this is acceptable and this is not. Others don't. And then the last one, which I didn't really even speak of, except to say it's just a much smaller part of the market, is the log mean scale. And here's the thing that always seems to pop up in the literature when we discuss log mean. It indicates that a 0.3 change. Now, what we're talking about on this 0.3 is think back to that H&D curve that I've drawn several times. When we increase our density, say, by zero point 0.3 optical density numbers. Remember those OD numbers from like 0.25 to 2.5 being our diagnostic range? When we increase that by a zero point 0.3, so if we go from a 1.8 to a 2.1, that's the same as doubling the exposure to the IR. Not necessarily the same as doubling the density. We're talking about doubling the exposure. See, all of these are measuring exposure, not necessarily density, because if you remember, density is a function of the software. Okay? So that's really as deep as I want to go on these for now. Remember the three, remember inverse direct, and remember that 0.3 change is a doubling or halving of exposure on log mean. Cool? All right. Now, when it comes to us, we know now, as we've drawn on the chalkboard and illustrated a few times in class, that exposure factor selection is easier in that we can choose so many more exposures that are diagnostically acceptable, but that doesn't mean that we need to just start firing things off willy-nilly. We have an absolute responsibility, an ALERA responsibility, that requires that we choose the right KV and the right mass for our digital imaging exposure. And as I said yesterday, I believe in class, KV tends to need to be a little bit higher, and that'll be because we talk about some stuff that we're going to talk about in a little bit, that K edge absorption layer thing. Needs to be a little bit higher for DR, CR than it was for film. Okay. Um, we get too high, we'll get excessive fog. And we've talked about that as well. How increased KV, increased energy to those photons will contribute to scatter and other things which degrade your image. We've got a super wide dynamic range, so we can get much wider exposure latitudes. And again, that translates for you. Wide exposure latitude means it's easier for you to use. We will repeat many, much less images because of exposure now. Okay? The danger side of this, you see right here, violating the Alera principles. And remember, I don't know that I said the acronym. But it is low as reasonably achievable. That's what that stands for. So going in there and just shooting a really hot technique just so because you know you can get away with it, that's an Alera violation. That's an ethical thing. And we're now in the industry recording exposure. So you will have an absolute responsibility to document how much radiation you use on somebody. All right, and then finally, um, the correct mass levels. Too much or too little is going to cause us contrast and model issues. And remember, quantum model, as we said, um, the figure we looked at on the board was that randomized clumping of photons, and it looks like a real staticky, noisy image. Just remember that. It's that knee image that we've discussed. Okay, moving forward. Um, how these things are put together, we talked about the other day. It's got that PSP plate, photostimulable phosphor plate. Let's go through this process of image acquisition, etc., that we've got here, okay? Strap in. The PSP plate, doesn't this look real similar to perhaps the intensifying screens and the film sort of discussion that we've had? Well, here's the actual active layer, the phosphor layer here. Um, it's all sandwiched together, just like you might see, in a deli or something. Each of these is adhered to the other. Um, this is where the light is created, and this is where the electrical signal is picked up and then transmitted somewhere else. And now that somewhere else could be, if you're talking about on your CR cassette, is going to be a storage area where then a laser beam is going to come in and scan that and read those electrons as they're released. Um, and we'll again, that's something that you probably have covered in the ASRT module, etc. We call these a filmless cassette because indeed there is no film. There is just that, remember, that white board that I pulled out and showed you in class the other day. And notice, if you remember the other day, it's not sensitive to light. It's much more sensitive to very bright light, but room light tends to not even transmit anything to it. The phosphors that they use, I think Dively asked about this the other day, barium fluorohalide, either bromides or iodides. You see how they're placed in there. Europium activated, that's the EU back here. Europium activated barium fluorohalide in a bromide solution, or europium activated barium fluoroiodide. Well, not a solution, but a suspension, really more. Gosh, I hate to call it a gelatin, but they're not liquid at all. Um, so there you know. I mean, that's just something you got to know when you move forward, because the DR works with different types of chemicals. You do need to remember these terms, and probably if you just remember europium activated barium fluorohalide, you're good. All right. Whether you worry about the bromides or the iodides, that's like a Ford Chrysler kind of approach to a problem. What I mean by that, Ford will make a car and they'll do their brakes a certain way. Chrysler will make a car, they'll do their brakes a certain way. Those two ways are different, but they're both brakes at the end of the day. Okay, so these are different manufacturers using different phosphors to get to the same end. So europium activated barium fluorohalide. When you see that, know that you're talking about a photostimulable phosphor plate, phosphor. Boy, that's a mouthful. All right, this thing K edge attenuation. I mentioned it a couple times, and I said what I what it really means to us at the end of the day is that we need to increase the KV from film to a little bit higher whenever we're using uh, PSP plates, CR cassettes. Um, we want to stay kind of inside that range. The best that we can do is between 35 and 50 keV. Now remember, this number is indicative to the average number of the kV. Remember that kVp, even 100 kVp, is around a third or so average energy. So when you're using higher kVps, you're just barely popping into this range here. Um, it says 35 kVp is the average energy of an 80 X-ray beam. Depending on where you look at that, remember we've used that term root mean square, where it's roughly a third to a little greater of the beam, depending on the tube, etc., etc. So when you shoot something at 80 kVp, this slide indicates that it's going to be about 35 is your average energy. Um, you're just really getting into that, into this K edge area, which is where you need to be. You've got to be in here. Bottom line, if as long as you're somewhere around in here, your patient dose will continue to decrease. If we're outside that range, we're going to need more exposure. Okay, so your patient dose will go up. So much below 80 kV, or work it out, much above 110, 20, and we're outside this best range here. It does, by the way, make the plate much more sensitive to scatter. Sometimes when those plates sit around for a day or week or whatever, well, not sometimes, when they do sit around, let's say for the weekend or several days straight, you need to go ahead and run them and discharge them and erase them. And sometimes you see me do that in the lab just to get them back to square one, because they do sit around and get scatter absorption. And depending upon where they're stored for for that time period, or the amount of background radiation, that can leave behind some sort of artifact. So you want to go ahead and discharge them and get them ready to use. All right. Um, and that's all this is saying. They're more sensitive to scatter than radiographic film. PSP plates. So if the question is from film to CR cassettes, which one's more sensitive to scatter? PSP. Film is also sensitive to scatter, but this is more sensitive. All right. Whenever you purchase a PSP cassette, the best thing about them is that they can be used in existing film type equipment. We use them just like film cassettes, but they've got a much wider latitude. I don't think I need to explain that any further. Many more techniques can give us a diagnostic image. But we use them just like we use regular film cassettes. That's a huge deal. So we can spend our money on the film cassettes and on the image plate reader and not spend our money on equipment. Fine. When we go to DR, we spend a whole lot more money on equipment, but we now can fire a whole bunch of people and save our money that way. When we're producing the latent image, those electrons that are created are stored here in the exposed image plate. Um, that those X-ray photons are photoelectrically absorbed. Again, I don't think I need to explain that. And that energy uh, is stored in there. And then we're going to go to the next step. They trap those electrons and hold them at these europium sites. Remember, it's europium activated barium fluorohalide. Don't get, oh my God, this is terrible. No. Electrons are created and they're absorbed. And they're held there in the lattice work until we're ready to release them. And then that'll help us create the image. So they fall into these holes. We call them electron holes. Your book discusses that a little bit. These electrons are created and fall into traps or holes. Um, and we've got to scan them, that is, put them in the image plate reader within, a relatively fast period of time. We can't store them Used to, you could store film cassettes as long as you kept them away from radiation for sometimes, days. And it's not the best, but you can. This cassette, this PSP plate, will lose, because they're electrical charges, will lose some of that charge, as this says, up to 25% of it in 8 hours, meaning that we're losing image data. Because they are electrons, they will first of all be charged and stuck in a spot, but over time, just naturally, they will come back to equilibrium. And as they do, they lose that image recording data capability. So it's important within a couple of hours of exposure to go ahead and get them processed. Because after 8 hours, you've lost a quarter of your image data. Whether that means density or not, not really. It's just you've lost a quarter of your image data, which will translate into perhaps a noisy image once you do. An experiment we ought to do is to make an exposure and then label that appropriately and then park it somewhere for a couple of days and then scan it and take a look at it. One of y'all do that. All right, so we're going to slide that thing in there. You guys have all heard the image plate reader. It'll grab that cardboard looking white piece, suck it in there, and it's going to scan by this using this laser beam. And when this term raster pattern means left to right. Okay, so this way, follow the mouse left and then back right and then back left and then back right. And as it scans through, it's liberating this data, and these electrons go back to their original energy state, and they give off some light, and this photo multiplier tubes capture that light, and bam, now we're starting to get somewhere. Now we're going to make an X-ray image. This light's converted to what we call an analog signal, and that is sent and changed into a digital signal, so something called an analog to digital converter. Light is in itself, if you track with a mouse, light is analog. It's a little bit on, maybe all the way on, and then back to off. Digital signals are on or off, right? So we're going to take this analog signal and we're going to convert it in the ADC to a digital signal because the computer requires digital data. Remember, when we first started talking about computers, it's either on or it's off. It's a 1 or a 0. That's digital. If it's a 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, that's analog. And the computer doesn't work well on that. It needs to know yes or no. And at the fundamental programming, and you don't need to know this, but I'm just going to tell you because I learned it. At the fundamental programming roots, every program, everything, as far as the computer understands it, it's on or it's off. That's it. There's that's it. If you know programming, you know I'm not telling you a lie. Once we've processed this data and get ready to send it off to the computer, then the image plate gets a really high exposure of white light, which erases or all those resets all those electrons and gets ready to use it again. All right, so this is what it looks like inside, and this is really what ours looks like inside. This is the part where you feed the plate in. This is the roller drive system. Now, ours has a great big drum back here, so it rolls this thing up, and then it scans it. There's a mirror, and there's a whole thing. I've taken this apart, not because I wanted to, but when you pull the top off, you can see some of this material. And it goes back and forth, reads back and forth. And then once it's read all the data, it hits that bright light on it again and sticks it back out in the cassette and pops it out to us, and it's ready to use. So liken this a bit to the automatic film processor, and you'll see there's some major differences. And there's some similarities here. We've got a film plate. Or not a film plate, but an image plate. We've got a roller system. Uh, but there's much more light going on in here. Of course, film processors are all nice and dark and full of wet chemicals. You're not going to find wet chemicals in here. Or at least I hope not. All right, so now how we're going to read this data. There's two ways, point by point and line by line. Of course, this is going to be faster line by line. Point by point takes more time, but I would suspect gives us a better image detail. And we had this discussion yesterday about how detail sometimes can fundamentally affect the ultimate diagnosis of the patient. So, give and take, folks. Give and take. Money, speed, it all starting to come together here. On a image plate reader, you can go between 30 to 200 plates per hour. I'll give you guys a guess. It takes about 45 seconds to do a 14 by 17 on hours. So, with the processing time and whatnot, yeah, we're probably at the 30 side. In a much larger facility where you've got patients, you guys see how fast patients come through sometimes. You might need something that's a little bit faster. All right. Um, anyway, I don't know if anybody's using these upright units. I haven't seen any of these, but they would put the image plate reader right inside the X-ray machine. I've just never seen one of those, but it's possible. I have seen a film. The Picker made something called the Picker Rapido, or APIDO, that had a film processor stuck at the end of the X-ray table, but I haven't seen one of these here. Anyway, it's possible, and it'd be, certainly cool. All right. So the photomultiplier tube, that's what PM means, is gonna determine or create our output signal. When you see this term discrete values is converted to limited discrete values, we're talking about digital, right? 0 or 1. And back to our discussion of pixel pitch and depth. Remember, we defined pixel pitch yesterday, the center from the center of one pixel to the center of the next, and then pixel depth, where we talked about bit depth, um, more shades of gray per pixel is what we mean. And again, as this number increases, the more data we have, the slower it's going to take to process, the more expensive it's going to take to store, all of that stuff. All right. And then also on pixel pitch, the less that distance is, the better our resolution. And again, I don't know how many times I've said this. We just having a super high detailed radiograph is not enough. We've got to decide how much is too much, how much do we want to pay for and store. I know I sound like your father, but yeah, it's all money. All right, so 10-bit depth, 1024 grays. Would you ever have to know this? I possibly, probably not for me, but possibly on the registry. The ADC gives us our bit depth, so a 10-bit depth gives us 1024 possibilities of grays available. 12-bit, notice we haven't gone up that much, it quadruples. See that? 16-bit, 65,000. Bigger, bigger, bigger files. The greater the bit depth, the bigger the image file size, the more money, here's your data again, for storage. All right? So how big is too big? That will be determined by your medical staff, really. The radiologists, the other physicians who utilize your equipment, utilizes the image from your equipment, will will have a lot to say about that determination. All right, and I know we've talked about pixel pitch and size, and when we did, we used this term Nyquist frequency. I'm going to leave this up there for just a second, and I'll restate what I said the other day. The sampling, or how the laser scans each pixel, its max is at about a half of the entire pixels in the array. That means the very best spatial resolution, we're taking a half of that. Um, the other pixels that we aren't scanning, as I said yesterday, are averaged in. So we'll scan or we'll sample about half, and that's again at the max. We usually don't. But let's say we did, and then the ones that we're not sampling, we average those in to the left and to the right. And it all depends on these two things down here, matrix size and image receptor size. The matrix, remember how many rows and columns we have, back and forth across here. And then the IR size, also sometimes known as the field of view or FOV, how big that IR is. 14 by 17, etc. 9 by 9, you'll see all kinds out there. Well, not all kinds, usually about 5 kinds. And in CR, or yeah, in CR, What do we got? 8 by 10s, 9 by 9s, 11 by 14s, 7 by 17s, and 14 by 17s. And I'm saying them all in English equivalents, but really it's metric: 35 by 43, 35 by 35, like 24 by 24s. Um, and I can't remember the 8 by 10s. But there you go. So you'll see those. And you can pretty much do everything as far as the image receptor size on 14 bys, 11 bys, and about 9 bys or 10 bys. You don't really need much anything beyond that. All right, so the file size, he said over and over and over again. How big are your pixels? How many rows and columns you have in your matrix, and what your bit depth is. So a single CR file is somewhere around 50 megabytes each, like a hand, something in there. An MRI study is a gig, 1 gigabyte of data. To put this into perspective, a typical Hollywood movie, about 2 hours in length, in high def, comes over my internet at around 3 gigs of data, 3 gigabytes. If I sit home and watch a movie on, what is it, Prime, Amazon Prime, I'm going to spend somewhere around 2.5 to 3 gigs of my data limit for the month to watch that movie. So when we do an MRI study, and we'll probably do, you know what, if we're lucky, we're going to do 12 to 14 or 16 a day. We're going to pop through a gig or more per patient. So that all has to be paid for. And remember what I said, if we've got a 1 gig MR study, that's really 2 gigs, isn't it? Because we're going to duplicate this and store one on site and one off site. So all of this doubles, and that's money. All right, now we can start doing fun stuff. Now we can start post or well, pre-processing and then post-processing. Pre-processing, find the raw data, get it ready, and then figure out what we want to do. How many projections we have on the image plate, how is it oriented. We've got to tell the computer what part we're doing, portrait or landscape, etc. How many, if you do 2 on 1. This we're getting away from. We did that on film all the time. We would do 2, sometimes 3 radiographs on the same cassette. It seems to be much better if we just do one image per image plate. Things seem to be better for the computer because computer, I've said this 100 times to y'all, only knows what you tell it, and it's not very bright because it really only understands on or off. All right, so here we can take this data here. Young Eric Carlton, the Cubs fan, bless his heart, poor kid, and we can change it, right? This ability to make our histogram into some sort of really nice radiograph. What we're doing here, this is like pixelated or blocky. This is almost World of Warcraft stuff, somebody said the other day. Um, Low value data, small file size, doesn't cost a lot. We can tell this is a kid. Well, he's not a kid now, he's like 30 something. But we can see that. But the farther over to the left we get, the more expensive we get because now we've got much more detail, many more things to see, much more shades of gray, much deeper, higher spatial resolution image. So you, manager, are going to try to make this determination. The radiologists want everything to look like this because they don't want to miss anything. You want everything to look like this because it's cheaper. You're probably going to land somewhere over here when it comes to putting all of your equipment together. If you mismanipulate the data, in this case they use the histogram for an adult on a pediatric chest, you're going to have an image that's just not very good. Remember what we said a histogram was yesterday. Now's a good time for you to look at that definition I had you write down for histogram. But I'll tell you anyway, it's a reference image for everything that you're going to do. This computer tried to take this child's chest x-ray and scale it into an adult chest x-ray. It doesn't work, folks. Densities are different. What I described to you yesterday, I said the computer knows where there's supposed to be areas of darkness outside the patient, lighter areas in the soft tissue, inside the patient, the spine, the heart, back. You know what? It's reading left to right, very simplistic. And if these densities don't match up with what the computer expects, well, it'll fix them. It'll make them match up to that. And that's a histogram error. Fortunately for us, that just means we'll go back and reprocess. And but used to, that wasn't the way. We'd have to go back and restudy the patient. Dose is the problem on that. So now we don't have to, thankfully. All right, different ways that these things scan. Fuji automatically will adjust these things. We've got hours on fixed, right? We don't want to to adjust the sensitivity or latitude. We do that on purpose so that you guys can see what your changes make. But in clinical, this is probably what you're going to see always. The raw data will still be there, but the computer scales it to some predetermined set. Everybody's agreed this is what we want to see, and the computer will make it fit that. Again, try not to be too detailed about it because it really doesn't deserve it. Alrighty, data clipping. It depends upon, now this stands for volume of interest, and that VOI is different for every part we do. That's another reason why we tell the computer what we're doing. It'll go into the lookup table. You'll say it's a chest PA landscape. It has that lookup table. It's going to look at that contrast, and you have to tell it what you're doing so they can get rid of the data we don't need. If we don't tell it what we're doing, it'll get rid of data we do need. We call that data clipping. Ta-da, that's it. There are some errors. Um, we told it the wrong thing, so it's not going to match the right histogram. We can't find the collimated edges. This is important to collimate on four sides. Follow the mouse point. We want to see collimation. We don't want this data to run off the cassette because then the computer doesn't know where it's supposed to end, and sometimes that'll just really mess up your image. Also, if somebody's got like a fake hip, shoulder, knee, those prosthetic devices in there, the computer does not expect that. And so that'll give you a histogram analysis error as well, because that becomes an abnormal area of increased attenuation. You see that? They're not separate. These are two really the same thing. Let's see what we got here. We want to make sure that we've got the edges of the IR identified. That's collimated edges. Sometimes implants of some sort can fool the computer into thinking it's there, and then the algorithm is all wrong, and your image looks terrible. I refer you back to that lateral knee that we looked back on a couple of days ago. I can't flip back to it in this program. It'll just mess everything up. Okay, here's a good one. Histogram analysis error, where you can see that now this, by the way, is masking done out here. This is not post-processing collimation. This is where the technologist told the computer to ignore all of this. It was indeed collimated down here, and the computer can't identify all of that real well, and so it scaled this image to be something else besides whatever it's supposed to be. I'm going to guess it's maybe some poorly centered SI joints. So it looks terrible. The data's there, but it looks terrible. And it's because the computer didn't know what to do. So the LUT helps to fix some of that. Sometimes, if it's pre-programmed properly, it'll tell you, it'll give you the opportunity to enhance those pathologies. Here's something that we all need to understand, and sometimes I even forget this. The computer, the contrast sensitivity of digital imaging is so much more sensitive than that of our eyes or that of film. I mean, it can just about get individual pixel size of increased or decreased attenuation. That if we give it the opportunity, it will enhance or make more visible pathologies and other things that otherwise we wouldn't have even seen, even on a piece of film. Um, I go back and forth when it comes to quality between film and CR/DR. There are some limitations as far as spatial limitations. Film crystals can be made smaller so they can have enhanced detail because of that. But the past couple of years, we've discovered that we can make display pixels in the output monitors also almost as small, if not as small, as the film crystal. So now we're approaching to where film and CR have the same ability to form detail. Whether or not we can display that detail, well, gosh, we're getting awful close with that too. I just refer you to Best Buy, to the ultra high definition televisions these days. So film and CRDR are to the point now where they can capture and express about the same levels of detail, spatial resolution, if we can see it. And now we can use some of these software tools to enhance that pathology. So I guess what I'm saying is, in a long roundabout way, is it's possible for us now to visualize things that perhaps we wouldn't have seen before. And there are people out there writing programs, you got an app for everything, to do like the first or initial screening view on, say, mammograms and other things without a pair of human eyes. Now, they do overread them to verify, and we haven't got to the point where it's actually marketable. But if you could screen a bunch of mammography with a robot and then ship the suspicious ones off to a doc, like a live doc, then she could overlook that, and you could make a whole lot more money. And of course, again, that's what it's all about. Uh, it's the science fiction guy coming out in me. Sorry. All right. So some other things that we can do, man, is just about anything. Uh, how's that? We can. It's akin to Photoshop. You can make anything look great. Here's what I would like for you all to do at some point. You don't have to do it tomorrow. Trot down to CT when you're not busy and ask him to show you a bone window of a skull. And then ask him to show you the soft tissue window of that same skull. You will note that all of that data was present. Remember, we're going from the left to the right, and all of that data was present, and you're only picking or window and leveling what it is you want to see. You want to see really high contrast, narrow window, bone. You want to see all the soft tissue, widen that window out, soft tissue. All the same data is there. Just you're choosing what to look at. Google that. Go to Google Images and Google bone window CT head and then soft tissue window CT head. And I will tell you the thing that blows me away is that we can get our contrast or our window so far open that we can see the individual hairs on people's heads. And then we can get it so narrow that all we see is the actual bone itself. And it's all in the same data set. And that's without any additional exposure to the patient. It's pretty amazing. All right, we can stitch together images. Sykeston's got this capability when they do scoliosis surveys. Take different exposures. This is not one single exposure. This is an exposure at one speed up here, a different speed here, and perhaps a third down here because of part thickness. And then the computer will stitch it together, and it looks like one nice long radiograph. This is a scoliosis survey. These are typically 30, no, what are they? 35 centimeters wide and gosh, 70 long, I think. Sykeston has this capability down there. I don't know if anybody else does or doesn't, but then all those images are stitched together in a nice seamless way. It's great for the patient because we can make three different exposures that are appropriate to the part thickness and then save our patient dose. And some of them may even do two exposures, may do like a chest x-ray level and then an upright abdomen level. So you might be able to do this with just two. But we combine those images. It's neat. We have a scoliosis cassette, and I think I've popped it open and showed it to you guys before. It's in our lab. It's a film cassette. And if I didn't do that, ask me about it, and I will. But I'll tell you, we've got different speed screens up here because it's a film cassette. Slower up here, faster down here for the exact same reason. The computer will stitch it together for you now, and it's awesome. Grids. We need to use grids. Grids should be used more often because of the increased sensitivity of scatter. See, I read that to you on purpose. There was, especially in the early days, um, applications, folks, that were telling people don't use a grid. Well, that's ridiculous. You need to use a grid. We've got scatter. You got to use a grid. Um, we don't want to cause what's called the moire effect, and that's this thing down here. If you try to Google that, it's hard to find. You'll find clothing, people with striped clothes. What this is like the raster pattern. This one is the raster pattern as it's scanned into the image receptor, or at the, let's say, at the image plate reader, and this is the grid on top of it. And because they are a little bit off from each other, it creates these diamond shapes in here, and you can see that show up on this patient's liver over there, right? So that creates objectionable artifacts. We call that the Moray effect. And again, I'm not French, but I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. So we must use grids. They're required. We got to use them properly. If the grid and the raster pattern match, then we could perhaps see something like that. Um, and if it does, we'll have to go back and shoot it. Flat panel or true digital radiography. Nybert Clinic folks are using this. I know some of them have it at Southeast. I know St. Francis has got this capability. No cassettes at all. We're using a photoconductor with a scintillator. All right, so it's totally different. It's not europium activated barium fluoro halide. It's amorphous selenium. I'm in there as far as your phosphors and things. Um, Big advantage here is speed. You can take an image with this DR cassette and, 10 seconds later, determine whether or not you want to keep it or repeat it. With a CR cassette, you're going to have to scan it. You got, pull the cassette, walk it around, whatever. You're talking minutes. This is seconds, making you more efficient, doing more patients in a day with a single technologist, making more money, and yes, we get to fire staff. Bigger outlay of money, but we may get back up in labor. So it uses amorphous selenium, as I said. It takes this ionization and creates an electric signal. It runs through what we call a TFT. Anytime you see this term in our world, we're talking about thin film transistors, and that sends it off to the computer for processing. It is faster. We've got a CCD. This is what you carry around on yourself in your digital camera or your cell phone. And we've got the flat panel. The CCD, as I said the other day, are just huge for as far as those are concerned. Not like in your camera. And 75, 100,000, 150,000, I don't know. A lot of money. So they don't bang that stuff around, don't break it. Some of them use a scintillator, and that converts X-rays to light, so that's an indirect step. And some of them take that electronic signal and convert it take the ionization events and convert it directly into electronic signal. So we've got indirect and direct. Two different ways that DR works, indirect and direct. Okay? All right, so here's our indirect, converting light into the electronic signal, and then send that signal to the computer. As I said, that's as deep as we need to know. Uh, and then the flat panel ones use what we call detector elements, DEL. You see that? This was in the module, um, and it tells us what was exposed and what wasn't. They call it the fill factor. How much of the DEL, how many of those elements were actually exposed, overexposed, underexposed. It collects all that data. Again, it's counting one and zeros and sends it off to the computer. The charge couple device, used with that scintillator, sends that directly to the computer. Um, I don't know. This is stuff you use every day when you take pictures of your cat or whatever and upload it to YouTube. All right, image processing, just like in CR, it does these things. It still uses the lookup table, still uses the histogram, but only the exposed DELs are used for image data. On the CR, we scan in everything. On the DR, just the ones that received some sort of data. Maybe that helps us speed up as well. Time is money. We get all of these different types of artifacts on there, similar to back when we were doing film. All of them caused by different things. I think you're going to see some of these examples in your module to come. And so I'm not going to beat on that now. Just know that this stuff's coming. All right. pages 358 or 356 through 358. I'm gonna turn here various artifacts in the book. Yeah, you got to use the book. Um, from left to right, I'm not going to read them to you. Take time here on page 356, 7, and 8 to look at what causes each of those artifacts. They do a great job of telling you what that is. I don't need to read to you folks, so I'm not going to do that. Heat, that's pretty cool. This is what we call a baby gram, by the way. You don't want to take them. But look at the exposure we got on this kid from above the ears all the way down to the symphysis pubis. Poor little fella. You don't want to do that, but it's showing us heat blur. So if you take that and you flip through and look at some of the things that can cause that, you can either find that in your book or you can look online. There's a lot of stuff about this online, or know that it's going to come up in the ASRT modules that I'm having you guys do. Non-parallel collimation. This is where the patient was positioned in such a way that the DR image plate reader didn't quite understand where the patient ended and the image data ended, and so it overscaled it. So it's just again an analysis or an artifact error. Um, this foot should look better than what it does, and we don't want to try to adjust that. We need to probably redo that again. All right, so 46 minutes I've been talking to you. I've finished up what I want to say here. I trust that you're going to read the chapter summary. I trust that you're doing your due diligence. I'm telling you, you need to understand this. I'm telling you that. Uh, I'm going to get this loaded, email everybody, and tell them it's out there. If the weather is bad tomorrow, that would be 120. We won't have class. We will let you know that on schcollege.edu. That's our website. Or you may get a Sonus email. Um, don't text me because I won't know any faster than you. So look online. But if I find out something, then maybe I'll forward it through Sonus. But pay attention to the weather. This is your class for tomorrow. So if we don't have class, what is today? So if we don't have class on Wednesday, that means you won't have a test on Wednesday. You'll have a test the following Monday. But this material is the material that I was getting ready to cover Wednesday anyway. So we won't be behind. Ladies and gentlemen, if I don't see you tomorrow, trust that I miss you. And have a good short, maybe, break. Talk to Fossey about clinical issues. We'll see you soon. Bye.